For a long time, tank games were some of the only ones I played, whether it was World of Tanks, War Thunder, or others like them. Being a gamer interested in tanks, you inevitably end up gravitating towards this type of experience. Unfortunately, this also means you have either experienced or been personally involved in the largely unnecessary back and forth between fans of these various games over which title is more realistic. Something I rarely see people discuss in these arguments, though, is the question of whether or not we as players actually want a realistic tank game. This question can honestly extend to more genres of game than just vehicle combat games, but I'm most familiar with military shooters and tank games, so I plan to mostly have this video be focused on them. I should also specify that there are people with different tastes, and some may actually prefer a more simulator-style experience. Games such as the various trucking simulators and the gaming rigs people will build for those titles are proof of that. While these are appealing to some and can work well for a few specific types of game, I don't believe it is a good idea when it comes to shooters or tank games in particular. In this video, I'm going to try and explain both why I feel this way and give examples of why it really isn't an achievable goal to begin with. I think a good way to start this discussion is to take a moment and think back to what it was initially that made us like whichever tank-related game you might prefer, or maybe the one you first played. Go ahead, take a minute, pause the video if you want, and just think back. Whether you were like me and first played World of Tanks on ultra-low graphics on the family PC, or maybe you got into it from a career as a tanker in the military. Either way, something about your game of choice caught your attention, and I have a sneaking suspicion it wasn't how accurately modeled a particular tank's suspension was. More than likely, you were hooked by the gameplay itself, with some preferring the more arcadey style of a game like World of Tanks or Armored Warfare, and others preferring a slightly more realistic style like War Thunder or its sister game Enlisted. Sure, it may be cool for a game to be realistic with things like how the tanks drive, how the armor works, and how accurately the tanks are modeled, but at the end of the day, if the gameplay wasn't appealing, you wouldn't have stuck around more than a few hours. Now, many of you may be thinking or even beginning to write in the comments something along the lines of, well, obviously, but that doesn't mean realism in games is bad, and I agree. My point in making this video isn't to say realism in a game is a bad thing, rather to point out that a game being more realistic doesn't automatically make it better or more enjoyable. Let me give you an example, and we'll use War Thunder since it's often considered the more realistic take on a tank game. Would War Thunder be more fun if in the next major update Gaijin made it so that every tank in the game had a realistic, accurately modeled transmission system? This would mean that just like in real life, many of the tanks in the game would require you to manually shift them to select between gears, and if you mess it up, you stall your engine or even cause damage to the transmission. Personally, I don't think that would be a very good change to the game, and I can almost guarantee players would instantly start to complain and stop playing the game over such a change, and for good reason. I'm by no means against manuals, by the way. My first car was a 77 VW Super Beetle, which is a manual, and while shifting when driving a car can be fun, I've never desired having to manage shifting my tank while also navigating the battlefield and controlling the gun. It would also lead to some tanks simply being better because they feature automatic transmissions, meaning the people using them get a free advantage. You may consider this a silly example, and it is a bit, but think back to when War Thunder first added night vision to the game. This was something many people had been asking for, and is something many real tanks have. How exactly do you balance it though? Some tanks have more limited night vision, or don't have it at all, whereas others at the same tier do. Ignoring the fact they required you to unlock the ability to use the night vision, which is a topic for another video.
See, this is why I don't play top tier. Every single time I do, it's a night battle.
How do I even turn on night vision? Does it not have?
No, you have to unlock it.
This realistic mechanic did little to nothing to improve the gameplay, and arguably made it worse. This is a big complaint I have with some of the other realistic features they have implemented, such as the commander overrides. While they are certainly a real thing many tanks have, many other tanks did not have them, which in my opinion leads to an unfair advantage in-game, which isn't fun to play against. There are many other small examples like this, whether it be thermals, laser rangefinders, or even ammo types that again, while realistic, can often leave engagements feeling unfair. Now some of you may simply say this is a skill issue and players simply need to get better at the game, and perhaps that's true, but let's consider some other examples of how attempts to improve realism would hurt the player experience. I don't want this entire video to seem like it's targeted at War Thunder specifically, so let's consider another example. This time, let's use the Battlefield games for our thought experiment. Battlefield uses a relatively simple system for their tanks. Certain weapons do a certain amount of damage depending on where they hit them. The front and sides take less damage, with the rear allowing you to hit for much more. Given the lesser role tanks play in Battlefield compared to a game focused on them, this makes sense and keeps things relatively balanced. Now, imagine if, for some reason, DICE decided they wanted to make their tanks much more realistic. So realistic, in fact, even the fuel consumption would be modeled into their vehicles. Instead of damage being easily repaired just by using your repair torch, the engineers are now required to haul the tank back to spawn to remove and replace damaged components like they're playing Tank Mechanic Simulator. Don't get me wrong, Tank Mechanic Simulator is a fun game, but I don't think anyone wants to have their Abrams knocked out of the fight for the entire match because the engineers at spawn have to pull the engine which took an RPG hit to replace it with a new one. Once again, this may be a bit of an extreme example, but it really is worth asking where you draw the line. What if instead of a massive change like that, DICE chose to implement more accurate armor models, now effectively making it impossible for RPGs to knock out a tank from the front? More accurate to real life certainly, but now you've also made the life of every player not in a tank significantly worse. Battlefield 6 has a pretty good example of a choice made for gameplay balance over realism with the SPAA vehicle. Now in general, the SPAA sucks in the current game, being worse than just about everything at the role of AA, but that isn't what I want to consider. Rather, I want to look at the effectiveness of it against infantry. Realistically, a 35mm armed AA vehicle should be able to decimate infantry, but as we've seen in previous Battlefield titles, that would lead to a fairly overpowered vehicle, so lowering the damage it does against infantry is an understandable choice for gameplay. This is a big issue I have with the people arguing over X game is more realistic. While a desire for realism in games, especially those advertising themselves as such, is understandable, there is a limit. A truly realistic tank game, or any game for that matter, would be so unbelievably unfun that 99% of players would quit almost immediately. Certain aspects of reality simply don't translate well to video games, even if they seem like a good idea at first. A great example of this are various games trying and failing to accurately portray ballistics or how the shells and armor interact. If you watched my previous video on German side skirts or tracks as armor, I barely begin to scratch the surface on the absolute black hole of a subject that armor ballistics are. You can somewhat see this in the various simulation videos showing armor and different shells interacting. If you wanted to properly model this, you basically need to implement everything from material science to fluid dynamics in order for it to resemble real-world ballistics. To give you an example, have you ever heard of something known as the edge effect? I'd like to eventually make a video on this topic, but to try and explain it in short, the closer a shell impacts to the edge of a plate, the less effective that armor is. This also extends to holes cut in the armor for things like viewports or machine guns, so not only does this create a hole in the armor which needs to be sealed, but also a weaker area around that spot in the armor. Now, there's nothing stopping you from implementing this into a tank game, and by doing so, it makes the ballistics behave more realistically. To those more knowledgeable on the subject, it would likely be extremely cool to see a truly accurate portrayal of how armor works in a video game. For For the average player though, now when their armor gets penetrated by a shell which doesn't seem to have the ability to go through their tank, it will just end up leaving them frustrated. So why go to the lengths to implement a realistic feature like this rather than using a much simpler armor model? What benefit does it truly provide to the game experience outside of impressing people who probably won't even play the game? Herein lies the answer, at least in my opinion, to the question posed at the start of this video. Do players actually want a realistic tank game? The answer is a pretty resounding no. Rather, what players want is a fun tank game. Super insightful conclusion, I know. As much as this seems like a fairly easy to reach conclusion though, it feels like many players and even game developers have lost sight of this, especially when it comes to things like lighting and graphics. Do we really need games that have realistic hair physics modeled down to the individual strand at the cost of it requiring a supercomputer to run? Do we really need every single individual thing inside of a tank pixel perfect just so it can magically eat my shell so I'm forced to send my fist through my computer screen when they proceed to kill me? Not only is this bad for the player, but it can also be bad for the developers as it inevitably leads to higher costs both to make content for the game and to pay for server capacity to process interactions between players. As I mentioned a bit ago, why dedicate resources to aspects in a game that will do little more than impress someone who will just use it as an example of why X game is superior to whatever other game they don't like, while playing neither? I'm not really sure how to end this video, but I guess I might as well give my take on what the ideal tank game would be, and as with most things in life, it lands somewhere in the middle. Whenever I think of this subject, my mind goes back to playing the game BattleBit several years ago, which was a very simple shooter which did a great job blending together games like Battlefield and Squad. It even included tanks and other vehicles, and despite the fact they didn't use detailed models or mechanics, it was still very fun to play. Sure, the graphics weren't anything special, and it wasn't some crazy new concept for a game, but the gameplay itself was enough to keep me playing. This is what I feel is lacking in the tank gaming niche and really only exists within places like Roblox or small indie projects. I think a game which focuses solely on a consistently fun player experience with some of the realistic aspects popular in games like War Thunder would be able to appeal to many people. Simplify the parts of the game like the armor and driving mechanics so that it can be accurate to the real-world vehicles, but without including the inherent randomness that comes from trying to model every tiny detail into a damaged model of the vehicle. This also avoids some of the issues modern games have with performance, allowing for more players to enjoy the game without needing the latest hardware. Is this a viable concept for a game? I don't see why not, but I'm also not a game dev, so I can't speak too much on this aside from describing my ideal tank game. That tangent aside, what do you think? Do you agree with my argument that realism ruins tank games, or do you disagree? Let me know in the comments. This video is a bit different from my normal history stuff, but I figured it would make for an interesting discussion, and it is something I see discussed in my community quite a bit. I am working on more history videos as well though, so stay tuned for that, hopefully coming soon. I also have a pretty big announcement which I hope to be able to make within the next few weeks, which I'm hoping will be a big next step for the channel. Thanks as always for watching, and to all of my ConelyFans who support the channel and my content. More to come soon, and I hope I'll see you then.